Welcome to the Waterbury Lecture. My name is Richard Duschel, and I am the Waterbury Chair in Secondary Education at the Pennsylvania State University. The Waterbury Chair is funded by an endowment from the Penn State alumnus and former faculty member, Dr. Kenneth Waterbury. The endowment's purpose is to enhance the university's commitment to the Commonwealth by furthering scholarly excellence in the field of education. As part of that mission, the Waterbury Chair hosts an annual lecture series featuring prominent speakers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education. To that end, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Roos, Lucille T. Werkmeister Professor at Philosophy of Science, Florida State University, who will deliver the first Waterbury Lecture this academic year on the topic of Darwinism versus creationism. Michael is the author of more than 36 authoritative works on the philosophy of biology, including the books Can a Darwinian Be a Christian and the Evolution-Creation Struggle. Today, we will talk with Michael about the ongoing controversy over the teaching of creationism, intelligent design, and evolution in American schools. Professor Roos, thank you for joining us. Before we talk about your perspective, Michael, let's establish some historical context. Help us understand a bit more about the centuries-old debate about the teaching of religion and evolution in schools. Possible talking points might be the Enlightenment, the Scopes monkey trial, or the Sputnik and its impact on science education in the US and the UK.
Well, that's a very interesting question, and like a professor, you're going to have to shut me up before very long. As soon as Darwin published, it was clear that there was going to be science-religion controversy. I mean, the famous debate between Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's great supporter, right, Darwin's bulldog, and the Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, incidentally the son of William Wilberforce of slave trade fame. And of course they clashed in Oxford, and supposedly Wilberforce asked Huxley whether he was descended from monkeys on his grandfather's side or his grandmother's side, and Huxley supposedly replied he'd rather be descended from a monkey than from a bishop of the Church of England. I don't think either of those were quite true, but certainly it set
out the controversy.
Right, there was a major controversy over this whole thing. Interestingly, though, my feeling is that in Britain and in Europe, the controversy was there, but was never that big or that significant. And even, say, by the 1880s, you find William Temple, the future Archbishop of Canterbury, embracing evolution, right, and saying this is terrific stuff. Right. If God wants to, us to come through evolution, that's God's business, not ours. Right. But of course, in America, it became much more significant, and almost from the start, there were major controversies over this. But I don't think I'm out of line by saying, as much as anything, the controversies were almost more sociological and cultural than theological.
Interesting.
In the sense that clearly there was an awful lot of tension between North and South after the Civil War. And particularly the South, of course, I won't say retreated, but entered into this major, what should we say, canopy of fundamentalism, of reading the Bible in a specifically literal sort of way, not traditional Christianity, but a very American literal way. And of course, this manifested itself most famously in 1925, when a young school teacher in Dayton, Tennessee, was prosecuted for teaching evolution. Right. And he was defended by Clarence Darrow, the great rationalist and agnostic lawyer, and William Jennings Bryan, 3 times Democratic candidate,
and widely covered by the news.
Right. But the interesting thing is, it's quite clear that then and since then, an awful lot of it was to do less with theology and more with, what should we say, modernism. That a lot of people in Tennessee didn't like the way that their children were being taught sex ed, all of these things, these sorts of issues. Right. And it's clear that the evolution creation issue was more a flag than a cause.
Okay. So given that historical backdrop, Michael, what are some of the basic tenets of Darwinism for scientists today? And have they changed over the years since 1925?
Well, the basic tenets, of course, are that evolution occurred, that we are, if you like to call it, modified monkeys rather than modified dirt, as Huxley once famously said. So obviously that's the main one. Then, of course, you've got the whole issue about causes, and there's no question that most evolutionists, including a young evolutionist on your campus I was having coffee earlier today, are deeply committed to the idea that Darwin's mechanism of natural selection is the fundamental driving force in evolution. Now, of course, this leads to a number of issues, particularly with Christianity. And
Correct.
of course, issues like, for instance, Darwinism, struggle for existence leading to natural selection. What about all the pain and these sorts of things?
Right.
Did God put in motion a process which was going to lead to a lot of death and destruction? How do you reconcile this with God? But also, of course, the whole question of human uniqueness. And if you accept modern paleoanthropology, in other words, the modern theories of evolution of humankind, what price Adam and Eve? And, that, of course, is a major sticking point for a lot of people.
So let's talk a little bit more about religion then, since you've brought it up and the clash that begins there. Michael, what are some of the key traditions within religious faith that are important to understand in terms of this debate between Darwinism and creationism?
Well, I mean, the thing is, you say religious faith, and it's a little bit like talking about what are Americans' convictions about politics. I mean, you ask one person and thinks Obama's doing a good job. You ask another person, thinks Obama's the worst thing that we've had since, well, in my part of the world, since Abraham Lincoln.
Yes.
But so it's at one level, it's a question which is misleading because it rather implies that all religions are the same and all Christians are the same. And the simple fact of the matter is that that's not so. Yeah. And a lot of Christians have no problem with science at all. It's more, let's call them, not all evangelicals, but let's call it the evangelical wing of the Christian church, which has based its position on sola scriptura, only scripture, but then, of course, wants to put this particular literalistic reading into the Bible and then extract out an opposition to evolution. Of course, nobody's a literalist completely. I mean, even evangelicals don't think that the whore of Babylon was a woman. They think it's the Catholic Church or Islam or something like that. So everybody interprets. But of course, the big sticking blocks, and you'd appreciate this as a geologist, the big sticking blocks tend to be Adam and Eve and the flood. And you as a geologist are going to say there just isn't, well, I assume you're going to say, there just isn't the evidence for a universal flood. I mean, there just isn't the evidence.
And the age of the Earth.
Right.
The idea that it's 10,600 years.
I mean, that's just not on. And students of human evolution will tell you there may have been bottlenecks, but bottlenecks mean 50,000 humans, not 2. So there's always, this is a big issue because particularly the whole question of original sin, it's not just a question of Adam and Eve, but how do you reconcile then the fact that there was no literal Adam and Eve with the Augustinian view that we are all at some level tainted because of the sin of Adam and Eve and that this has been passed on down to us. So these, I mean, these are major theological issues, and I think it's quite wrong of my fellow non-believers, the new atheists, just to trivialize these things, because I think that genuine, serious people are wrestling with issues like original sin. And
you're talking about people like Richard Dawkins and, Christopher Hitchens, who just passed away recently.
That's right. And what I'm saying is, I don't necessarily myself accept the Augustinian position on original sin, but what I would want to say is I think that serious people that's a very serious answer to a serious problem. And was it Paul Tillich or somebody said the only part of Christianity which has empirical verification is original sin, and anybody who looks at the last century and thinks that there's not something to this is just plain wrong.
Right. So recent Gallup polls show that 46% of Americans do not believe in human evolution at all, and only 15% believe humans evolved. You've already started to touch on why we see such a big gap between scientific explanations and the public perception of science. My next question is Is this uniquely American? Is this a uniquely American debate? Do we see this in other parts of the world?
Well, of course, you see it also in countries which have embraced extreme forms of Islam.
Okay.
I mean, the interesting thing is all this thing in America about the evils of Islam and seeing this as, you know, a tremendous threat and all of these things. I mean, the one place...
That's a common denominator.
Right. The one place you're going to see this kind of fundamentalism is amongst, you know, extreme Muslims. So the answer... So it's not unique to America.
Right.
Having said that, it's certainly... in the West, much more an American phenomenon than it is a Western phenomenon, although, you know, America, like Coca-Cola, spreads everywhere. But, I mean, I lived for 30-odd years in Canada, and I mean, certainly out West, you're going to find fundamentalists or biblical literalists, but somewhere like Ontario, where we even have state-supported Catholic schools, this is just basically a non-issue. And if you would ask the average teacher in a Catholic school in Ontario, do you teach evolution? They'd look at you as though you were queer in the head. Of course we teach evolution. I mean, you know, what else? I mean, we teach democracy too. Do you mind? So yes, the answer to your question is that it is an American phenomenon. But as I say, it's partly it's a cultural phenomenon as much as a theological phenomenon. I mean, for instance, when people are running for presidencies, we've seen, for instance, how the issue of Romney's Mormonism is a major factor in this campaign.
Right.
Whereas, for instance, in Canada, I don't think there's any question that we've had Christian prime ministers. I mean, we now know that Pierre Trudeau was deeply committed Catholic.
Right.
But it would just never be a matter of discussion at a general level.
And Tony Blair shifting over from one religion
as we
to
know,
another.
Tony Blair was clearly a very high Anglican and became a Roman Catholic after he... But what was the famous phrase? Somebody said, "We don't do religion." And what they meant by that is, you know, we may not have a constitutional separation, but we have a very strong de facto separation. And this is, I mean, even places like, France or Italy, you get this separation. I mean, the one place where you probably don't get it is in Poland. But, I mean, certainly elsewhere you get this separation. And so at that level, it's very much an American phenomenon. But as I say, America has a lot of missionaries.
So let's talk a little bit more about that American phenomenon. In 1981, a lawsuit was filed by the ACLU against the state of Arkansas. You participated as an expert witness for the plaintiff. Tell us a bit about that trial and your testimony that creation in science is neither testable nor tentative. What does that mean? And let me ask the next question then to sort of give you a lead for it is, how does this help us establish in any way a demarcation between evolution theory on the one hand and creation theory and intelligent design on the other?
Well, go back to Arkansas in '81. What happened in Arkansas is that the state passed a bill, which then became law.
The superintendent of schools.
That you had to have balanced treatment. In other words, if you were going to teach evolution, you had to teach so-called creation science, which was 6 days, Adam and Eve, and flood. And of course, immediately the ACLU jumped in and brought suit on ground of non-constitutionality. And I was one of the expert witnesses, along with the theologian Langdon Gilkey and the late Stephen Jay Gould and one or two others, who appeared to attack this law. I was the philosopher there. And of course, what I claimed, what I would still claim, is that fundamentally evolution is science and creation science is religion dressed up to look like science, and the judge in fact accepted this. Now, I have to say that there was considerable controversy in the philosophical community about my claims, because a lot of people wanted to say, no, creation science is not so much religion, it's just bad science, and it's refuted. I mean, it's just plain wrong. But of course, the trouble with that argument is the Constitution bars the teaching of religion in public schools. It does not bar the teaching of bad science in public schools. So the case had to be made that not so much that creation science is bad science, but that it is in fact religion. And I still feel pretty good about my testimony on this, because I don't think that you can separate out the claims that people make from their intentions, from the cultural background that they're bringing to it, and a lot else. And it just seems to me very clear that creation science is driven by a particular evangelical American 19th century perspective on the Bible, rather than by, tell us just the facts, ma'am, just the facts.
Right, yeah. The dragnet approach to,
you got it.
to teaching science. So the demarcation question is a ticklish one even today in philosophy of science in terms of trying to draw some kind of a very clear line between what is and what is not. So Arkansas in 81, and then we fast forward almost 20 years later to right here in Pennsylvania in Dover.
Yes.
And we see it come back. And these trials, they serve as flashpoints and in an ongoing and stifling tension. And we see the moves that the creation scientists make in terms of first creation science, the equal time debate, and then the intelligent design. In your book, Can a Darwinian Be a Christian? You argue that we should be cautious about stirring tales of opposition against Christianity or between Christianity and evolution. Can you tell us more about the essence of that argument?
Well, I mean, the essence of my argument is the following. I think the greatest theologian of the Christian church was St. Augustine, around about 4 centuries after Christ. And amongst other things, he tackled the whole question of science and religion. And basically, Augustine said, look, we're educated Romans. We know things that people like Abraham and others did not know. And if God had spoken to Abraham and his followers and in terms of modern science,
right,
they wouldn't have known what they were talking about.
Right.
So God obviously had to cloak things metaphorically. It doesn't mean to say that God was speaking untruths,
right,
but it does mean to say that we've got to roll with modern science, and to do so is to deny our God-given abilities,
right,
the things which make us made in the image of God. So this was Augustine's position, and this, of course, has been the Church's position ever since. It's not always handled it very well. I mean,
right,
the Galileo episode we all know about, but fundamentally this has been the Christian position. So where then does the American opposition to science of this nature come from? And it's pretty clear, as historians will tell you, that this is very much a development of the young republic after the War of Independence,
right,
when, of course, all the leaders, people like Washington and others, were in fact de facto deists.
Right.
I mean, they all pretty
Jefferson
much denied the divinity of Christ.
Right.
But it wasn't an ideology to run a new nation on.
Right.
And so, of course, the preachers moved in.
Right.
And in the 1830s, 1840s, of course, you get not only the Second Great Awakening and the development of this sort of evangelical view, but, of course, you get all the offsprings like Mormonism and
right,
Seventh-day Adventists and
Church of God
Brethren.
and Assembly of God.
I think the Christian Scientists are a bit later, but you get these things. And then, of course, this, as it were, gets calcified, solidified by the Civil War. And after the Civil War, you see the North going very much for science and a much more liberal view of Christianity. And of course, the South then, and as you move west, condenses itself very much and retreats into this biblical literalism, where sermon after sermon is preached on issues like, we are the Israelites in captivity. God afflicts those whom he loves the most.
Yeah.
So this is the point I was making earlier. I see an awful lot of what we're living with today as cultural, both today's culture and culture from the past. And I think that we see this very much, for instance, even in things like the presidential race that we've got. It's so much a cultural difference of things like Medicare, for instance. How should we be running our society? Should it be a society which reaches out to the stupid and helps them nevertheless? Should we have seatbelt laws? Or should we simply say, look, you're free individuals, it's your choice? Mm-hmm. And I think we see this in the healthcare thing. And of course, I think it's backed by ideologies, and I think that evolution, creation gets mixed up in this. But as I like to say, I see so much of this as almost a flag for cultural issues rather than things which are rooted in deep theological issues.
Right.
I mean, there are many people in the North who are evolutionists who believe that Jesus died on the cross for their sins.
Right.
I mean, this is not, an arguing point that, we are saved because of Jesus' sacrifice. That's not the issue that we're arguing about. We're arguing about things like homosexuality and abortion, things that, forgive me for saying this, the Bible is not terribly relevant to, in many respects, to 21st century America.
Right. How does it map to it? So you write about many of these barriers between Darwinism and Christianity, and you see them as perhaps opportunities to advance understanding. Your claim, in fact, is that Darwinian can be a Darwinian can be a Christian, and a Christian can be a Darwinian. Explain some of these barriers and how can they be overcome?
Well, remember, first of all, do remember my final comment in the book is that it can be done, but it's not easy. But whoever said that important things in life are easy.
Right.
So I don't want to trivialize these things.
Right.
And, you know, this is where I part company from my fellow atheists, the new atheists, who seem to think that these issues are things that, you know, we can almost discuss in the faculty club over a few drinks at the end of the day, because I think we can discuss a lot of things in the faculty club, but I don't think we're going to solve these issues quite that readily. So I do want to say that I think that that Darwinism does raise some very serious issues, particularly about Adam and Eve, for instance. If you want to...
The origin, as you said.
I mean, if you want to reject Adam and Eve as literal persons, if you want to reject the Garden of Eden and the serpent and eating the apple or whatever it was, the fruit of knowledge, as literal events, then I think as a Christian, one's got to say, well, what are the other alternatives? And for instance, a good friend of mine, John Schneider, who used to work at Calvin College, argues that there are other traditions, for instance, which see the creation story less as a literal event of a fall, but more of one as a developing that we are created almost in an evolutionary way, and that the story of the fall is a story of our incompleteness, and that what we see in the whole story of Christianity is much more one of a developmental story, where, as it were, Jesus's sacrifice on the cross is not what he likes to call plan B, where God had to do something after we'd messed it up, but where God, you know, always planned to do something of this nature to help, as it were, lift us in our developing way. Now, whether or not you accept that or not, and I'm not saying you should, but I think what you've got to do is grapple with issues like this. What I want to say is Christianity, philosophy, theology are not left, as it were, gasping, oh my God, what are we going to do? They've got huge resources from 2,000 years of theology and philosophy and these things to tackle these issues. What is not going to work, I think, is simplistic answers. You know, simplistic answers never work. I mean, I always think that Noah's flood is not about, you know, animals on an ark. It's about simplistic answers, that God says, oh, I'll wipe it all out, and what happens? After the flood, Noah gets absolutely stinking drunk and his kid walks in and laughs at him. In other words, he doesn't get rid of sin that way. Walk into Iraq, it's simple to do this, but it doesn't solve the problems. And I want to say that important issues like this are not going to be solved by, you know, simple readings of the Bible, nor incidentally, are they going to be solved by, you know, simplistic arguments about religion that I think you find in books like The God Delusion and so forth.
So we were talking about the Catholic faith earlier, and in 1996, Pope John Paul declared that evolution is more than a hypothesis. Then in 2004, Pope Benedict released a statement recognizing that all living things descend from one organism. Most recently, in 2007, the Pope described the conflict in the United States between evolution and creationism as absurd, writing, "Evolution appears to be a reality which we can see and which enriches our knowledge of life and being." How significant are these statements, Michael, in terms of shifting the conversations that are here in America?
Well, of course, as I say, I've been stressing the cultural aspect, and so let me continue to stress the cultural aspect. John Paul II was very conservative theologically, no question about that. But don't forget he was a Pole. He was not only a Pole, he was a professor at Krakow University. And who was the most famous professor at Krakow University before John Paul II? A chap called Nicholas Copernicus. And so John Paul II, who, as we know, was tremendously proud of his Polish heritage, always took science tremendously seriously. He always felt that, for instance, the work of Copernicus and his followers was a tremendous, what shall I say, addition to Christian civilization. So,
and Copernicus restructured the Christian world.
So
and
I think
Galileo's
that John
trial.
Paul particularly always had a let us say, not just a sneaking sympathy for evolution and for Darwinism, but a very candid and open and frank embracing of this.
So,
and of
in
course,
the right place and the right time.
Right. He wanted to say that immortal souls are, but he said that's a religious issue. It's not scientific. So the funny thing is, although John Paul II, in many respects, was incredibly conservative, when it came to science, and you see this. I mean, I've met Orthodox Jews who, simply won't turn the light on Saturdays, but say to me, of course I accept evolution through natural selection. Why wouldn't I? It's just not a conflict for them in that sort of way.
Right.
But I think that, of course, what is happening is with the new Pope and with some of his followers, I think he's trying to wrestle with an awful lot of issues. And I think, frankly, he doesn't have the same empathy for science that John Paul had. And he sees, and I think with some reason, that often, we see this with people like Dawkins, often science is at the forefront of a materialistic, humanistic approach to life. And he sees this very much as a cultural threat. And so I think that what we're seeing there is something of a reaction to these sorts of things. So as I say, again and again, and I don't want to deny theology, because I think we start with theology and probably we end, well, I'd like to say we start with philosophy and end with philosophy, but so I'm not denying these, but I think the only way to understand a lot of this, and you're a science educator, so I hope I'm preaching to the converted, that it's not just the science folks, it's the culture. And that anybody who's going to be a teacher, particularly in our society, and go into the classroom and talk about issues like Mendelian genetics or plate tectonics, which, your field, has to be sensitive to the culture in which he or she is working. It doesn't mean to say you're going to compromise. It doesn't mean to say you're going to pretend that plate tectonics didn't
knowing
occur.
who your clientele are.
But you've got to be aware of what's going on, and you've got to approach these issues empathetically. And so, as I say, anybody who wants to deny that this is culture, folks, is not only naive, but I think they're betraying themselves and their students.
So let's come back to the schools, as you started to talk about, Michael. Even with the Catholic Church endorsing evolution theory, we still see schools around the country teaching intelligent design. A popular position is that we should, quote, teach the controversy. That has some resonance because some people say, well, isn't that what scientists do? They debate and they compete and teach the controversy between two competing theories. Then there is the Creation Science Museum in Kentucky. Which is
I've been there. Great fun. I enjoyed it immensely.
I was wondering if you had.
I've been there.
I'm still debating whether I want to support that.
No, I wouldn't have missed it for the world.
So what are your thoughts here, and what advice would you give to educators and to teachers facing the controversy in the classroom?
Well, my thoughts after visiting the Creation Science Museum is why did they have curtains on the Ark? That was the big thing that I and my students talked about. These things are clearly going on all the time, and these are issues that we've got to wrestle with. And how do we deal with this? This whole business of balanced treatment. And I know that this is totally phony when it comes to pedagogy. You and I. If I don't want to sound condescending or an old, what is it? I don't want to sound like that. But if you and I want to talk about these issues and disagree with them, we're grown-ups, we're talking about them, we've had our training, and if we want to, we can stop the conversation where we like. But if I'm a teacher and you're my student, or conversely, then I've got certain obligations to you, and I've got to follow those as a teacher. And it would be quite wrong of me, for instance, because I've got some view, let's say, about the Earth, to teach flat earthism or something like that. More than that, I wouldn't teach the controversy either. If I'm a medical teacher, I'm not going to say to the students, now, on the one hand, we've got modern medicine, and on the other hand, we've got the Jehovah's Witnesses who don't believe in blood transfusion, and we've got the Christian Scientists who don't believe any of it, and then we've got the witch doctors or the medicine men who believe this. Or even, let's say, something like chiropractic to
Right.
get, to get very heavy duty, as it were.
Sure.
I want to say that if I'm a medical teacher, then let's take something like chiropractic. I mean, I've got obligations to teach you what I understand as. Now, it doesn't mean to say I'm not going to say have a course on alternative medicines, because as a physician, I'm going to meet a lot of people who are going to come in with a lot of views.
Questions
But
that.
that's not teaching alternative medicines because I think they're true or because I want to teach the controversy. It's because I want you to know what's out there. So similarly, I would say, look, any good, let's say, grade 11 or grade 12 high school could well have discussion groups about alternative beliefs. I would hope that you have, even though they're all Christians, I would hope they might have something on Islam and deal with it sensibly and sensitively.
Right. So in England, the students do take religious study
but
courses.
I don't want in science classes, let's have phlogiston and let's have, Lavoisier's chemistry. Let's have particles for light. Let's have wave theory. And you kids, you can decide.
Right.
And I don't want 6 days of creation, universal flood, and Adam and Eve literal, and evolution. And okay, kids, you decide. I think as an educator, and I hope I'm preaching to the converted
You
here,
are.
You've got moral responsibilities to your students. Be sensitive, but being sensitive is not being... As Richard Dawkins, I've run him down a bit, so let me quote him. He says, let's not be so open-minded that our brains fall out. And I think there's a lot of truth about that.
Okay, well, that's good. Well, Professor Roos, it's been a pleasure talking with you. To view Michael's Waterbury Lecture to Penn State students and faculty, please visit the Waterbury Lecture Series website. Thank you for joining us.
A terrific pleasure.